So we're recording. So if we're ready, I will crack on. Okay. Hello and welcome to the next episode of When Tomorrow Comes. I'm Charlotte Orrell, Senior Futures Consultant in the iCini Futures team, and I'm lucky enough to be joined this week by some of my wonderful colleagues. So from our Futures team, we have Dan. Hello, Dan.
Hi, Charlotte. How are you doing?
I'm good. And from our Impacts team, we have the twosome. So we have Joe. Hi, Joe.
Hey Charlotte, thanks for getting us on.
All right, and hello, James.
Hi Charlotte. Looking forward to having a chat.
Good, glad to hear. So this week's blog looks at how the development industry can do its bit to reduce the environmental consequences arising from our development projects. And we also have a little bit of news ourselves in relation to that, which Dan will touch upon a little bit later. But in a usual fashion, Joe, as the author of our weekly email, do you want to give a bit of a summary of the themes, main points you're trying to get across?
Yeah, sure. Thanks very much. So this week's article looks at embedding environmental principles into development design and whether this is actually a barrier, which it can sometimes be perceived to be, or actually an opportunity that we should be taking advantage of and using to promote the sort of climate agenda. So this article kind of came about when I saw this quote from Greta Thunberg, which said, "The climate crisis has already been solved. We already have the facts and solutions. All we have to do is wake up and change." And that got me thinking, how can we as environmental practitioners, consultants, architects, planners, how can we apply that to our sort of day-to-day work to deliver the development schemes that our clients and communities desperately need, but also to meet those environmental challenges and embed those principles into the first stages of the design process.
Thanks, Joe. That's very helpful. Yeah, I guess I might start off with Dan first. My experience, probably from more planning side, is that environmental requirements, sustainability, etc., is been more at the forefront of people's minds more recently, both of developers and local authorities. I don't know if you agree with that statement.
Yeah, I mean, it was only a while ago where the sort of sustainability and energy side of things was given only a sort of passing mention in local plans and in planning considerations. Since local authorities have declared climate emergencies up and down the land, the importance attached to these issues has rocketed up the agenda. So schemes that are now being sort of submissive for planning are now being very heavily scrutinised to make sure that they are doing their utmost to meet climate change targets, reduce their environmental impact. So yeah, it's been a bit of a wake-up call for a few people in the industry, but it's definitely encouraging to see the issue being given its right level of importance by local authorities.
And James, I don't know if you have any feedback on that, but equally in the work that you do, especially obviously with EIAs, whether you've been coming across any particular challenges that have arisen during the sort of pandemic period in your work and as part of that planning process.
Yeah, I think just kind of picking up firstly on what Dan said about I guess the industry being more aware and being more proactive about the climate emergency and climate change impacts. I think in EIA terms, it's something we've seen a lot more in the last 4 years since the EIA regs were updated to the 2017 regs, which now has everyone having to consider climate change in their assessments. So, now that it has to be considered, I think developers now are getting a lot more information about their schemes and the impacts they've got. So, that can only be a good thing as that requirement has progressed and methodologies and guidance has improved. I think we're starting to certainly see in a lot of the schemes we work on these impacts being drawn out and mitigation being provided to try and solve those impacts.
Yeah, it's good to see that these things aren't being considered at the end of a project, but they're actually now being properly thought out at the beginning of the scheme. and integrated from the outset, because obviously it's a lot easier to get it right if you kind of think about it at the start of the project rather than try and shoehorn it in sort of final 2 weeks before you go to planning. So yeah, I think that sort of increased level of awareness is certainly helping to make the right decisions early on in the project process.
Yeah, I think you know, obviously Jo touched on that in her article. It's always been a key push of ours to try and get the design team and the developer thinking about these impacts early. That's always been a key push, whether it's from an ecological or visual impact point of view. But now that's really kind of come to the fore on energy efficiency and other climate measures that can be put in place.
And yeah, so James, you kind of touched on it just then. For those developers who are thinking or placing environmental goals higher up their agenda, what actually are the targets they should be looking for? What are the end goals that they should have in mind? Because I can imagine, although there's a greater appreciation of where environmental should sit and the fact it should come earlier, but there isn't necessarily understanding of what they should be trying to achieve.
Was that one to me? Sorry, Charlotte.
It's to you, it's to anyone. Yeah, feel free to pass it on if you don't want to answer it.
No, that's fine. I think, you know, obviously, I guess in terms of specific targets, Dan would be a lot more familiar with, I guess, what's happening. But in terms of when the government started to really push net zero by 2050 a couple of years ago, and everything, policy is slowly catching up. I think the London plan quite quickly got in there with 35% reduction on greenhouse gas emissions. So, you know, there's targets that are being built into policy. I guess the difficulty for developers and the solutions that need to come to is how a new scheme fits in its environment over the next however many years, because while CIA has historically been focused on mitigation, the 2017 regs are quite clear with climate change. It needs to look at climate change adaptation as well, and how schemes, even once they're built, can continue to, you know, not be having these big impacts.
I think the long-term effects is a real challenge, and that's something that we're still trying to work through, because all these new targets, you know, they are relatively new, and, you know, the schemes that they apply to at this stage, you know, are in the process of being built out, possibly, but when, you know, they're not occupied, they haven't been running for sort of 10-20 years. So it's hard. That's what we're trying to figure out as an industry, how we can actually transfer those early commitments that we make in our environmental statements, for example, and how they could be measured sort of in perpetuity, essentially, and ensure that they deliver the benefits and the environmental sort of impacts that we're that we're proposing. The thing that springs to mind to me is I attended a few workshops on biodiversity net gain, for example, which is going to be a key factor in the upcoming environment bill whenever that gets published. And there's a need for developers to deliver a 10% net gain above what is on site currently, and that's a great objective. And, you know, it has its own challenges in terms of measurability. But a lot of questions that we're asked are, you know, so we say we're gonna deliver these measures to deliver this 10% net gain, but what happens if we sell the site? What happens then if, you know, if we can't deliver because circumstances change, we can't deliver it? You know, how do we sort of keep this going with, you know, a constantly evolving baseline, and you know, we can't predict the future. We don't know what the situation is going to be in 10, 20, 30 years time, so ensure this is still being delivered.
From the energy side of things, as James touched on there, is basically what you're basically aiming to do is to future-proof your scheme against forthcoming regulations. So as we know, we're all going to be net zero as a country by 2050, but designing development to be ready for that 2050 objective, which basically means designing development to not make use of fossil fuels, you're essentially trying to decarbonise development at the same rate as we're decarbonising the national grid. So that means no more boilers, no more petrol, diesel cars. Everything is increasingly electric, and making sure that development is ready for that decarbonised, all electric, net zero carbon economy is really the critical thing to get right early doors, because you don't want to have to go back and retrofit your scheme in a few years' time because the regulations are saying, well, you now need to kind of make sure it's all ready for 2050. So that making sure that you're future-proof is really the key thing from the energy side of things.
I think what I find quite useful as well is there's always certain local authorities that might be ahead of the game on things like this as well, and start producing SPGs and their own policies, and you can usually see the trickle effect of them adopting those policies, it going into other boroughs. And I find that quite a useful starting point to predict what other authorities might do and might bring in at a future date, especially if you're planning a development within one of those boroughs. It's quite helpful. I think that leads quite nicely into Dan providing a little announcement about what we're doing as a company to achieve some of those standards, etc. Go on, Dan.
Yeah. Thank you, Charlotte. Yeah, it's a very neat segue. So yeah, trumpets, drum rolls, whatever you want to do at the ready, because Iceni is now a carbon neutral company. We received our accreditation from Natural Capital Partners, who have provided us with the transparent, third party and robust assessment of our carbon emissions, and we are now a carbon neutral business. So we've gone through this journey as a means of kind of reducing our emissions first through the adoption of increasingly energy efficient plant and services for our offices where we can. We're buying all our electricity from renewable sources. We're not burning any fossil fuels ourselves in our offices. And then we're offsetting our residual emissions through renewable energy projects in India and China, both of which have got fairly high carbon emissions intensity. So through this range of measures, we're very proud to announce that Iceni is now a carbon neutral business, and very happy about that.
Yeah, it's great news. And for any other companies wanting to do the same, how easy is the process?
It's relatively straightforward. You basically need to provide the accrediting organisation with a bit of information about how many staff you've got, where your offices are, how many offices you have, what the energy use of those offices is, and they will basically run the assessment process for you. And the advantage of obviously having it done by a third party is that it's then completely transparent, accredited. There's no cooking the books, because it's essentially being audited, your carbon emissions. So yeah, they need a sort of fairly detailed amount of information on your company activities. But for a consultancy business like ours, which is mainly office based, we don't have large amounts of emissions and products coming through the business. It is fairly straightforward.
Amazing. Thanks, Dan. A final question then to all three of you. We've sort of spoken about where we're at now, in a sense where we see environmental goals perhaps leading, although there's a bit of a question mark around looking into our crystal balls. Obviously what we're doing as a company. But it'd be interesting to know what your thoughts are on what we can do to strengthen going forward. What objectives should we have in place? What should the government be doing? What should developers be doing? What should local authorities be doing? I don't necessarily want all three of those, but any grand ideas of how we can move this along and basically benefit from people's current attitudes towards environmental and sustainability goals. Who wants to jump into that first? Who wants to take it?
I'll go first. So, in terms of buildings, it's relatively easy to build a net zero carbon building, a new build project. And what we urgently need to do is tackle the energy efficiency of our existing stock. Millions of homes out there aren't fit for purpose. They aren't going to be ready for 2050 net zero carbon economy. And we need some joined up government thinking to encourage people, make it sort of appealing for them to undertake energy efficiency improvement works to their homes, make them ready for
Yeah,
Go on.
I guess, sorry, I'll jump in now. I think from a sort of from a developer's point of view and a local authority point of view, it's about ensuring that the environmental objectives, whatever they are inherently linked, as Dan said. You know, it's about into the design process. Like there needs to be some sort of tangible sort of output that considers the environmental objectives just as much as the engineering and the sort of social side as well. And I think it's about capitalizing on people's interest now and sort of saying, yes, okay, we recognize this is important, so how can we make that, how can we embed that into sort of policy legislation to take it forward, to ensure that the targets that we've set now and the targets that we set in the future are met.
Yeah, I agree with that, Joe. I think it's never been more at the forefront of everyone's minds, the climate emergency and what we should be doing. And as I said before, with developers and the amount of information that they're now required to provide through, you know, the planning process and the development process, it's really starting to use that effectively and start to integrate that. And that, you know, that needs to come from the top and trickle down, as we said, into policy, and really start pushing developments into being as sustainable as they can and ready to adapt over the next 30 years and beyond.
Amazing. Thanks, guys. That was really helpful. Very interesting. Let's hope the trend continues then, and the enthusiasm continues going forward. And for anyone who has been viewing, obviously, if you want advice on becoming carbon neutral, you now know who to speak to. So for those who's listening, thank you for checking in. Thanks to the three of you for joining me and for that conversation. And we hope everyone joins us again for next week. Bye, guys.
Thanks, Charlotte.
Thanks, bye.
Cool.